On Tuesday, July 23, 2024, the Ashley Benefield trial formally began with day one and opening statements. And on the same day, the Florida State Attorney's Office made quick work of their witness testimony, calling 8 witnesses. Immediately, the jury was given 2 very different pictures of both the wife, the defendant, and the husband, the alleged victim. On the one hand, the prosecution said the defendant was someone who made a calculated decision early on in their marriage to become a single mother, and that she would stop at literally nothing to get full custody of their young daughter, to include taking the life of her estranged husband. On the other, the defense said that the alleged victim was actually manipulative, abusive, and dangerous, and that the defendant became very afraid of him very early on in their relationship, and so desperately tried to get out peacefully with their daughter, like so many domestic violence victims out there. And according to the defense, the defendant killed the alleged victim in self-defense because she feared for her life. On the lawyering side of this trial so far on day one, the defense attorney, Neil Taylor, did struggle a bit, and so we'll talk about that a little bit in this video. The prosecution, on the other hand, is moving very competently and efficiently through their case in chief. But as far as the facts are concerned, serious and sobering details were revealed on both sides of this marriage, to the extent that I don't know at this point how I can personally come down on this side, and nor can I predict where the jury is actually going to conclude. Let's get into it. So because I haven't put out a primer video on this particular case, let me give first basically a really quick rundown of what this trial is about. Ashley Benefield is on trial for second-degree murder for the shooting death of her husband, Doug Benefield, on September 27, 2020. At the time that she shot him, she was in her early 30s and he was in his late 50s, and they had a young daughter together who was 2 years old. Now, there are a lot of weird things about this case. One is that the relationship went by a pace that a lot of people would say was kind of alarmingly fast. When they met at a political function in Florida, she was a former ballerina and he was a very wealthy man. And then within 13 days of meeting, they got married in South Carolina. At the time that they got married, she was in her mid-20s and he was in his mid-50s. Not long before this, Doug Benefield had become a widower when his wife of many years died of a sudden heart condition, leaving him to raise their teenage daughter, Eva Benefield, on his own. Now, after Doug and Ashley got married, they quickly brought a young daughter into the world. And early on, there were signs of trouble in the relationship. Things got messy. They were living apart, with her moving to Florida. And even when she was pregnant with Doug's baby, Ashley accused Doug of poisoning her. She filed a domestic violence claim against him, but the court in Florida concluded that she didn't even have a scintilla of evidence, not a single chinchilla of evidence to support that claim. Anyway, things continued to devolve and they got into a bitter custody dispute over their young daughter. There was some talk apparently about reconciliation, where they planned to move to Maryland for a fresh start, but still living separately. But as Ashley was moving out of her residence that she had been living in with her daughter and her mother, Doug apparently was with her to help the move out. It's unclear if she had invited him or if he had invited himself. But something happened that day, and in her bedroom, she ended up shooting Doug. She doesn't deny pulling the trigger, but she argues that she was acting in self-defense. The state, however, argues that she murdered him to end the custody dispute. So, which is it? Murder or self-defense? Let's see how things shaped up on day one. So as always, this case started, just like any other one does, with opening statements. As a reminder, the goal of opening statements is to provide a basic roadmap for the jury to understand what they can expect to see. This is a great time to introduce a theme that can be echoed throughout the trial to reinforce the basic narrative that the side wants the jury to adopt. This is not a great time to just throw facts, dates, names, places, and data at the jury from the very beginning. This is because the jury is so fresh to this brand new case, they need to get a quick rundown, a quick introduction, so that they can build a basic framework, a filing system, if you will, to be able to understand the basic issues and to be able to organize the evidence as it gets introduced to them. Okay, so that's the basics of the opening statement. So how did the opening statements go in this case? Let's start, as always, with the prosecution. Overall, I think the prosecution's opening statement was a fairly good one. It was somewhat concise. It didn't get too detailed, but it did give enough for the jury to understand what this case was about. It did kind of jump around in the timeline, I will say, but it wasn't so bad that you got lost in the sauce, so to speak. Right from the start, Assistant State Attorney Suzanne O'Donnell established the narrative that Ashley Benefield decided, while she was still pregnant, that she wanted to be a single mother. And so the prosecution said that Ashley made a plan for this, and that ultimately in September 2020, she made this a reality. According to the state, the case was about a custody battle that Ashley was willing to win at all costs, even if it cost Doug his life. And what's more, the prosecution set this theme of duplicity, that Ashley would be one way in front of Doug and completely different when Doug was not around. O'Donnell went through the basic timeline that I already gave in my little intro piece and added a few other details. Apparently, early on in this relationship together, they decided to start a ballet company. However, this ballet company crumbled basically before they could even get it off the ground. Also, apparently when they met, Doug had had a vasectomy from his prior marriage. But very quickly after Doug and Ashley got married, something like within a year, he had a vasectomy reversal and Ashley got pregnant very quickly. And like I said, there are some really weird things in their relationship history. For example, when Ashley got pregnant, she apparently had really bad morning sickness, and so she decided that she wanted to live with her mother down in Florida so that her mother could take care of her. So while pregnant, she moved herself from South Carolina to Florida. And this is weird, I will admit. Obviously, pregnancy symptoms can vary widely. Personally, I've been very lucky throughout my pregnancy to have some very mild symptoms. Knock on wood, but I know plenty of other women who have had very, very hard times in pregnancy. So it could be, in fact, true that she did have a very hard time with her pregnancy and that she needed extra help. But if the instinct in that situation isn't to move closer inward into their relationship for support from your spouse, I think there's something very wrong there. What exactly that means, I don't know that I can formulate a conclusion, but clearly that's an issue for a newly married couple, and on top of that, a newly acquainted couple. And according to the prosecution, this moment when she moved from South Carolina down to Florida, that was actually the very last time that Ashley and Doug even lived together. They apparently continued a long-distance relationship, but then around the time that their ballet company collapsed, she started making these claims of poisoning and DV against Doug. Then, the prosecution said that she gave birth in Florida while Doug was in South Carolina, and she didn't tell Doug about the baby being born. The way he apparently found out about the birth was in the context of a series of complaints that she was making about Doug. She also filed a restraining order against him, but this was where the court found that there wasn't a single chinchilla of evidence to support her claim. So Doug was granted visitation rights to finally meet his daughter for the first time when his daughter was 6 months old. Then Doug and Ashley apparently started to try to work on their relationship. One thing that apparently came out of this was that Ashley was talking one way when Doug was in the room and another way when he wasn't. When he was there, she wanted to work on the relationship. When he wasn't, she had no interest in doing so. Now, eventually there became this plan for Ashley, Doug, and Ashley's mother all to move to Maryland. Still, Doug and Ashley would live separately, although they would work on their relationship. At least that's apparently the understanding that Doug had. But according to the prosecution, Ashley knew that this was all a ruse. This was because on September 30th, 2020, there was a scheduled court hearing for the custody of their daughter. And apparently what would come out is how she acted one way with him and another way when he wasn't around. And so on September 27th, 2020, 3 days before this information would become public, she shot him. The prosecution said that this was so that she could secure once and for all custody of their daughter. And now, as to the actual shooting incident, O'Donnell also wanted to highlight to the jury 3 points from it. First, Ashley was the only one that was armed between the two of them. Doug had no weapon of any kind on him. Second, Ashley was not injured at all in this incident. When she was examined, she had some superficial scratches, but that's about it. Apparently, that's what the evidence is going to show. And third, the prosecution said that the trajectory of the bullet that went through Doug was side to side, not, for example, entering from his front and going out his back. This is an important detail in terms of a self-defense argument, because was he aggressing against her? Was he turned away from her? What was happening in the moments that led up to her actually pulling the trigger? All of this, of course, is to paint Ashley as a manipulative, devious, and calculating person who feigned domestic violence as a means to keep Doug from his daughter, and that she murdered him when she knew she couldn't get what she wanted from family court. What the evidence will end up showing, of course, is another question, but we will see where this goes from here. For now, that was the prosecution's opening statement. How did the defense do? As you can imagine, the defense painted this case as a very different kind of situation. Defense attorney Neil Taylor said that Doug was a manipulative, cunning, and abusive man who absolutely insisted on control over Ashley and their daughter. And right away, the defense made some serious allegations about Doug that, if true, are going to be some substantial hurdles for the prosecution to try to disprove this idea that Doug was a serious abuser. For one thing, Taylor said that the evidence would show that one time Doug fired a handgun into the ceiling of their kitchen to stop Ashley from talking. He also said that in another incident, the evidence would show that Doug threw a loaded gun at Ashley. He also said that Doug apparently punched their dog in the face hard enough that he knocked it unconscious. And he said that the evidence would show that Doug regularly carried a concealed firearm that was racked, meaning that it was pulled back and ready to fire. And then, on top of all of that, Taylor said that the evidence would show that Doug was essentially stalking Ashley while they were living apart as well. For one thing, he said Doug unlawfully placed a tracker on Ashley's vehicle. He also said that Doug was regularly observed following Ashley in her car in Florida, even while he was living in South Carolina. He even said that Doug was caught by a neighbor at night standing in the neighbor's backyard to get a look at Ashley. And to top it off, Taylor said that Doug also had a prior history of domestic violence, and he said that Doug actually even admitted to the acts that I just mentioned. So all of that is some very, very heavy stuff, and we'll see what the evidence does actually end up showing through these witnesses. If it ends up being true, like I said, it's a big problem for the prosecution. But if not, this turns out to be a bill of empty promises by the defense. Now, as for Ashley, Taylor said in his opening statement that her behavior in this case was classic domestic violence victim. He talked about tendencies that DV victims often have, like walking on eggshells around their abuser, developing a go-along, get-along attitude, and more. I will say that this could be one explanation for what the prosecution called duplicity, why she might be one way while he's there and another way while he's gone. So which one of those is a proper characterization, of course, is going to come down to the evidence that comes out at trial. Anyway, Taylor further said that the evidence would show that Ashley talked to other people 3 years before the shooting, telling them how afraid she was of him. He said the jury would learn that the move to Maryland was initially actually her attempt to get away from Doug, but that Doug decided to move there on his own following Ashley. They all were apparently sharing a moving van, so on that move-out day, she gave him permission to enter the residence for logistical reasons. But Taylor emphasized they both knew very well that the relationship was over. Initially, he said, there was a discussion about how they would pack things because they were sharing a moving truck. But Taylor said the evidence would show that on that afternoon, Doug started making threats against Ashley and got increasingly aggressive and hostile. He then body checked her in the home twice. She then tried to get him to leave and he refused, saying that it was his choice if he wanted to do that. So in response, apparently Ashley headed for the front door to leave and he grabbed her by the arm, saying, "Where do you think you're going?" And in response to that, Ashley apparently said that she was done and that he needed to leave right away. And so, according to the opening statement, the evidence will show that Doug's response was to smack her upside the head. And the defense says that they will be producing photos of the swelling to her face and her eye to show this. Now, I will say this is interesting because the prosecution said that they checked on the day of the shooting as well as a few days later for any kind of injuries on Ashley and that they found nothing. So the photos here could become very important to either corroborate or produce inconsistencies in Ashley's narrative. But according to the defense, after all the threats and threatening behavior, this moment was the first time that Doug actually struck her. So, at this moment, she headed for her bedroom where she had a firearm. And here's how Taylor explains the moment that she shot him.
Terrified after this, fearing for her life, she heads for her bedroom where she has a firearm. She gets to the firearm, she turns around, she orders Doug to stop. When she looks up, he's in the doorway. Instead of seeing the gun and leaving, Doug gets into this warrior pose with his arms moving purposely and advances. At that point, petrified, she fires, believing that if he gets a hold of her, she will be either seriously injured or killed. To her horror, after firing, he continues to advance. She absolutely panics. She tries to get away and backs to the side to create more distance between them, but there is no place left for her to go in this small bedroom. At that point, in utter panic, she keeps firing the gun. She sees Doug's legs go up in the air, almost as if he was running and slipped, and he falls backwards. Instinctively, she flees the house and heads next door to John Sant's house. He's a neighbor.
And so that was it for the defense opening statement. Right after this, like I said, the jury heard from 8 witnesses called by the state. The first witness was Tommie Douglas Benefield Jr. He was Doug Benefield's first cousin, and he testified that the two of them were actually really close throughout their adult lives. As part of this, he talked about how both of them had served in the Navy at the same time, for example. And when Doug died, he said that Doug was 59 years old and 5'9" at most and very slender. This, of course, is important so the prosecution can show that Doug was not a very large, imposing figure. And so this, of course, is to rebut this idea that he was some sort of big, scary abuser. But I will note there are other ways that someone can use physical force and use violence against someone else in a relationship, regardless of size. So we'll see how all of that shapes out. Anyway, Tommie also testified about some of Doug's relationship history. He said that before, Doug had lived with his wife Renee and daughter Eva until Renee died in December 2015 of an undiagnosed cardiac arrest. It sounds like it was kind of a sudden death and just a surprise to everyone. 9 months later, Doug met Ashley. In the spring of 2017, Tommie apparently first met Ashley in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where they were living together when he was flying for Southwest Airlines and happened to stop in there. Tommie said that he didn't know about Ashley until he actually met her in person, and that Doug and Ashley were already married at that time. Tommie also testified about how they told him on that occasion about how they met, how the relationship developed, and Ashley's background. During that visit, they also talked about wanting a kid and him getting a vasectomy reversal. Anyway, Tommie also testified about the couple's attempt to establish a ballet company, how it failed early, and how Ashley moved out while she was pregnant. He said Doug rented out his South Carolina home and then moved down to Bradenton, Florida for visitation of his daughter. And he said that they never showed anything actually in front of him other than love for each other. Now, in cross-examination, the defense tried to do a few things. For one thing, they really tried to hammer in that Doug had some kind of specialized close combat fighting training from the Navy. But when Taylor asked Tommie if he had that from his time in the Navy, Tommie said, "No, I never got that from the Navy. I got it from the airline that I worked for afterwards." Anyway, then there were a few other things that the defense tried to elicit from Tommie. One was that Tommie was supportive of Ashley after things dissolved in her relationship with Doug. Doug agreed that he expressed support for Ashley in her version of events in May 2018, but he also said that he was texting Ashley in this way to keep communications open with her. And I have to say, this is a fairly reasonable explanation. If you've ever known a family where there has been a divorce, and particularly a divorce where there are children involved, other family members might step in to communicate in maybe softer ways with the now ex-in-law to basically help smooth things out to keep the kid or kids in the extended family. This is a fairly common occurrence after all. So the defense was definitely trying to say that Tommie knew that Doug was abusive and that he supported Ashley, but this didn't quite land the way that the defense wanted, at least in my opinion anyway. And then the defense really struggled because Taylor really wanted to go, I think it was going a little far in making Tommie look like some kind of a creep. Specifically, he tried to get Tommie to admit that he texted Ashley that she quote-unquote married the wrong Benefield. But there were a number of problems with this. Number one, Tommie pushed back and said that he never texted that. And so then Taylor, the defense attorney, tried to impeach Tommie on what his text messages said. But when Tommie looked at those text messages that were presented to him, he said there's nothing in here saying that. And so then Taylor tried to sort of blend this impeachment attempt into an attempt to refresh Tommie's recollection. Procedurally, this got very problematic. Part of it is because of the fact that there was really no indication that Tommie was even having a problem recollecting in the first place. And this just ended up getting so messy until it quickly devolved into Taylor arguing with Tommie over what these text messages actually said. And they were sitting right in front of both of them. And so at this point, Judge Matt White ended up sending out the jury so that the two legal teams could hash out what was going on and how they could correct course with his testimony. Honestly, this was just a mess. This is not smooth lawyering by the defense at all. Anyway, while the jury was out and the two sides were arguing, Judge Matt White did admonish Taylor in a couple ways. For one thing, he did tell him that it was unprofessional that while arguing in this sidebar or this meeting outside the presence of the jury, that Taylor called the witness a creep. At least he didn't say it in front of the jury, but even outside their presence, Judge White said, "I don't want any of that in my courtroom because I find that to be unprofessional." Honestly, I really like that personally. And so far, from what I'm seeing from Judge White, I see someone who is very organized, very kind and warm, but also kind of lays down the hammer a bit on his courtroom rules. I love all of that. But anyway, on a bit of a more embarrassing note, Judge White also told Taylor that he expected him to know the difference between impeaching a witness and refreshing a witness's recollection.
As I've mentioned before, and I mentioned pre-trial, I expect attorneys to know the differences between impeachment by a prior inconsistent statement, that's one path. Refreshing recollection is a second path, and introduction of past recollection recorded, which is a separate path. And the reason I'm sustaining the objection is because it started off with refreshing, does it refresh your memory, and then we got right back into the documents themselves, which I've already ruled were hearsay. So it's for impeachment purposes only. You can ask him about what I allowed you to ask what his feelings were, but not to get into these documents themselves.
And then when Taylor showed the text to Judge White to try to further make his case on why these text messages, these troublesome text messages, should be allowed, Judge White looked at the text messages and then looked up at Taylor and said, "This doesn't even say what you're asking him to say."
Sir, this doesn't say what you're asking him.
Now approach. Thank you, wrong Benefield. Miss Benefield says, "That's very cool. You should be so proud of what you were doing." His response is, "Thank you, wrong Benefield." What that means, Your Honor, what that suggests is, thank you, you should have been with me.
Sustained.
I assure you, Judge, that any female will draw that conclusion immediately.
That does not match what you're asking, sir.
So it's not a proper impeachment, and the witness was absolutely right to push back in the way that he did. Honestly, this is not a great start for the defense here. It sounds like he's trying to overplay his hand as to what the evidence says and try to make the witness, who is not on his side already to begin with, try to agree with him on something that is not really something that he's likely to agree on. And there's honestly just no way to force him to do that if the receipts don't specifically say what you said that they say. And also, in that last clip, Taylor's assertion that any female will understand that to mean that this meant that Ashley should have been with Tommie instead of Doug, I can't say that I agree with him on that one. And so this is also an indication that Taylor may have a rather monolithic way of understanding how women think. And this can be a problem if there are women on the jury who do not think like he assumes that they will, and more specifically, if he's building trial strategy based on his assumptions about how these women are going to be thinking. I'm not saying this to point out some sort of moral deficiency, but just on an objective level of him trying to accomplish his goals with his trial strategy, he can end up running into some big problems. Anyway, after this, the defense was allowed to ask the witness whether he subjectively felt like Ashley had married the wrong Benefield. Tommie denied it, and there was nothing that the defense could do to try to combat that answer. Anyway, next was the state's second witness. This was Eva Benefield, the daughter of Doug and Renee Benefield. At the time of Doug's death, she was 15 years old, so she was young, but still old enough to understand a lot of the things that were going on at the time. Anyway, she testified that in August 2016, she first learned about Ashley when she was on the phone with her dad. This was 9 months after Eva's mom died. She said that her dad mentioned that he had a girlfriend and he was considering bringing her to an event. Then Eva said that she found out 2 days later that they weren't dating, they were married. Despite all this confusion, she described them as very lovey-dovey in their relationship. And she said that she and Ashley were friendly at first. However, Eva said that this changed when Ashley tried stepping more into a mother role by reprimanding Eva, which Eva did not appreciate. Honestly, given how very many 15-year-olds think, I can see this being the case, that would be a very quick way to not allow for much bonding between the two of them. And so Eva said that their interactions basically broke down, with Ashley often becoming temper tantrum-like. She also described Ashley as having overreactions to small things. And she also said that Ashley would strongly voice her opinions to Doug over and over and over again, and that Doug would sit quietly and just listen. Now, in terms of potential abuse, Eva said that she never saw them actually fight, she never saw her dad yell at Ashley, and she never saw him threaten Ashley or do anything physical against Ashley. And so on cross-examination, the defense actually focused on two main points. Number one, the defense was able to get out of Eva that Doug did in fact have some hand-to-hand combat training. This came out in the context of his conversations with Eva about her own self-defense training growing up. She apparently herself had a black belt. And the other thing that the defense wanted to get out of her was corroboration of these other violent outbursts by Doug that allegedly happened during the relationship. One of these was Eva noticing a hole in the ceiling of the kitchen, which she agreed was consistent with the size of a bullet. Another was a hole in the drywall of the home of the kitchen, which was consistent with the size of a fist. She said her dad eventually patched it, but that it did exist at one point. She also said on cross-examination that she was not aware of any kind of a DV injunction in place in South Carolina. However, this did seem to suggest that there in fact was one, she just didn't know about it. And she did also say that both Ashley and her dad were fixated on her. This word fixated was very important. And on this point, the defense also ended her cross-examination by emphasizing that she agreed that her dad specifically was fixated on Ashley. Okay, so then the third state witness was John Sant. This was Ashley's next door neighbor who called 911 when Ashley ran to his place right after shooting Doug. As you can imagine, the substance of his testimony was primarily about her running over to his house frantically and then him calling 911. He testified that she came over in the early evening, but while there was still daylight out. And when he opened the door after hearing some pounding on it, he said that Ashley was there. Now, before he said anything, he said that she actually volunteered to him. He attacked me. Doug, he attacked me. She then said that she shot him with a handgun and she came inside to John's house. Then she also told John that her mother and her daughter were at the park at the time. And so he called 911. Naturally, of course, they played the 911 call in the room. And on the recording, you could hear Ashley basically hysterically crying in the background. Also, as they played it in the courtroom, the camera was on Ashley basically the whole time. Now, I don't love it when they do that because it often feels gratuitous, especially when we're trying to get the testimony from a witness. We're trying to observe a witness as they're testifying. And here it did start to feel a bit invasive. However, it did also show what the jury undoubtedly could see, which was her reaction to hearing the 911 call. And anytime that a defendant shows an emotional reaction, people are going to respond whether they think that these emotions are real or fake. Now, personally, for my part, I don't know. I think grief can show up in different ways in different people, although there were moments when it did look a little bit forced, I have to admit. But overall, I think it's a little too soon for me to be able to make any kind of conclusions one way or another on that particular point. Anyway, the witness testified that he saw no injuries on her, no bleeding, and she didn't complain about any injuries to him. As to her clothing, he said that there was nothing that was ripped, nothing that was out of place. And on cross-examination, the defense highlighted that Ashley was visibly shaking, she was stuttering, and that she seemed overall to be terrified. The witness also testified about seeing the firearm that she had used, which had a round lodged in it. He said he's very experienced with firearms and that in his opinion, this was not from holding it properly. Specifically, she was holding it too loosely when she fired it. Now, personally, I don't think this testimony should have been allowed because it was testimony properly reserved for an expert witness. There wasn't enough foundation to show this man's expertise, even if he does regularly shoot guns on a firing range. That does not make him an expert. But the prosecution didn't really object, so ended up coming in, and basically now there's this suggestion that there was a problem with the firearm ultimately due to the fact that it seems Ashley was somewhat inexperienced with firearms when she decided to actually use it. Anyway, the fourth witness of the day was Deputy Thomas Baurle of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. On September 27, 2020, he was one of the officers from the sheriff's office that responded to John Sant's 911 call. Basically, his testimony was just to establish that he arrived, he put Ashley in handcuffs and secured her in his patrol vehicle, then he checked the house for anyone else, and that he observed her for injuries after that. And from what he could tell, there were no injuries to Ashley, and there was no one else in the home other than Doug. So eventually he took her to the station. Now, on cross-examination, the defense elicited from Deputy Baurle that Ashley was visibly upset and that maybe she was in shock. And then that basically was it for the fourth witness. Anyway, the fifth witness of the day was Detective John Jones. He is a property crimes detective from Manatee County Sheriff's Office, but But in September 2020, however, he was a detective for the Violent Crimes Task Force. And like Deputy Baurle, Detective Jones responded to the same 911 call. And basically his testimony was to establish that when Detective Jones arrived, he was the first one to get to Doug. He said that he went into the house and saw Doug laying down in the middle of the floor with what appeared to be a bullet wound to his side. Then the prosecution introduced to the jury the clothes that Doug was wearing when he died. After that, Detective Jones also testified that when he touched Doug was already cold. He didn't try CPR, however, because immediately following him was EMS and they took over those attempts right away. Okay, so the sixth witness was Detective Tyler Ackerman. He was on the Violent Crimes Task Force of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. And on September 27th, 2020, he arrived on scene responding to the 911 call. He said that he saw Doug being loaded onto the back of the ambulance when he arrived. And he also saw Ashley getting looked at for any potential injuries. And then he located the firearm on the ground just next to the front door. When he examined it, he said that he saw a live round lodged in the chamber, so he ejected it to disable it and then put it into an evidence bag once it was safe. Now, in cross-examination, the defense tried to get him to say that the firearm was jammed. However, Detective Ackerman disagreed, saying that the slide was merely not in the fully forward position, that's all. But he did agree that one possible reason for the slide to not go back to its fully forward position is because it's not being held firmly enough when fired. And he agreed that that often comes with practice and knowledge of firearms. But he also said that it could be simply because a shell casing got in the way on its way out and prevented that slide from moving all the way forward. Either way, it definitely seems like we are starting to see a pattern here where the defense is hinting that Ashley was inexperienced with firearms and that this somehow supports the idea that she didn't murder Doug, but she acted in self-defense. Anyway, so the seventh witness was Meghan Dvorack. She was a crime scene technician from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. And so she was responsible for taking a bunch of photos at the scene. And so first she took photos of Ashley. Then she collected Ashley's clothing for evidence, noting along the way if she could see any injuries on Ashley's body. First, she said that she saw no injuries to Ashley's face. Then she said that she looked at Ashley's arms, shins, and legs. She did say that she observed some redness to her right forearm and a minor discoloration on the back of her left leg and her upper right thigh. She also said that she documented Ashley's left ear because her attorney who appeared on the scene advised her that they saw redness on her left ear. And although she didn't see any redness, she said that she did observe some superficial scratches on Ashley's body. For example, there's one scratch just below Ashley's breast line and another one right by her right hip. Now, what came out on cross-examination was that Miss Dvorack also collected some DNA samples that day. First, she took a buccal swab from Ashley. And then she said that she also took some touch DNA swabs from Ashley's hands, wrists, and forearms. Now, understandably, the defense definitely wants to establish that Doug's DNA was all over Ashley's arms from grabbing her in this sort of abusive move. But remember, he also was there ostensibly to help her move stuff. So I don't know how much of an inference can really be drawn from the existence of his DNA on her hands and arms, because his DNA would likely be all over the same stuff that she's touching throughout that day or throughout that afternoon, regardless of how much time he had even spent there. Either way, we'll undoubtedly get some testimony from another witness as to the results of those tests. Okay, so the final witness of the day was Amanda Conlon. She was another crime scene technician from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. And on September 27th, 2020, she also was called out to the scene also to take photos and gather evidence. Ultimately, she took photos of the inside and the outside of the home. Also, Detective Ackerman gave her the firearm that he found and secured, and so she documented that as well. And one thing that's interesting to see, having watched the Karen Reed murder trial before, is the way in which this evidence was treated. For example, although we saw photos of the firearm in a paper bag, this does appear to be a proper evidence bag as opposed to, I don't know, say a Stop and Shop bag. Anyway, next the prosecution entered the firearm into evidence, although they did not yet show it to the jury. Next, she said that she documented the entire house before any evidence was collected. Outside, of course, from the whole part where Detective Ackerman handled the firearm to make it safe. She also described how she moved through the whole house to take photos along the way, and then she said that she focused on the room where Doug was shot. The photos of this room were not shown on camera, and for this, I am quite grateful. Although this is important evidence for the jury to see, for our purposes, it does reduce some of the salaciousness that can come out of a lot of these trials here, and I really don't have any interest in seeing the grotesque aspects of, someone who actually was a human being who died being splashed all over the internet. Anyway, they did, however, show some photos as Miss Conlon testified about the various projectiles found in different parts of the room, as well as the trajectory rod they used to figure out the path of the projectile bullets. Next, she also testified about the various firearms that they found unsecured around the home. Now, as a reminder, this was the home that Ashley was sharing with her mother and her young daughter. And apparently, at least some of these firearms were found in closets and elsewhere already loaded. Granted, they were moving, so things aren't necessarily going to be where they would be under normal circumstances. But this does appear to show, even temporarily, at the very least, an unsafe environment to be keeping a very small child in, regardless of their moving status. Anyway, then they found 2 cell phones, one on the couch and one in the garage. Both were admitted into evidence, and I suspect we're going to see something about some cell phone extractions from those phones. Also, Ms. Conlon testified that she took photos of Ashley's face and body a couple days after the incident to see if anything showed up later. And she testified that she saw no injuries other than superficial scratches. Now, I will say, cross-examination on this one didn't really seem to move the needle all that much. One of the things that Taylor did was to draw out of Ms. Conlon that she took a photo of Ashley's concealed weapons firearm license. And now, I don't know much about the process of getting this kind of license, especially not in Florida. But if this requires someone to show that they have some experience with a firearm in order to get this license, then I don't know why the defense would draw this information out if he's otherwise trying to show that Ashley isn't all that experienced with firearms. So this is a bit of a contradiction that the defense is drawing out on its own. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see if there's anything that comes in that sort of clarifies this potential contradiction. But other than that, he also pointed out that when she took photos of the crime scene, she didn't know if anything had been moved between the incident and the time when she got there to take photos. And that's kind of reasonable. Of course, she wouldn't know that. And that could be potentially problematic if things in fact had been moved. So we'll see if there's anything else that comes in about that particular topic. But other than that, that's basically it for day 1. As I said, I can see some potential evidentiary hurdles for both the prosecution and the defense. It does seem to be that there's some corroboration already of the allegation that Doug was abusive and even physically dangerous with those firearms around. But there are things on the defense side that don't seem to add up, particularly as it relates to Ashley's injuries. The defense did say in opening statements that they would be providing photos of Ashley's face showing swelling from Doug hitting her face that day, but the photos shown in court on day 1 depict an entirely different reality. So we'll see if we do end up seeing those photos and if there's an explanation as to why the prosecution's photos don't show this. And ultimately, there are a number of questions that have to be answered. For example, was there actual abuse in this relationship? If there was abuse, did it have some kind of limits prior to all of this happening? Was Ashley perhaps exaggerating and overreacting to small things like Eva testified she would often do? All of these are questions that will need to be answered by the end of this trial. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you tend to side with the prosecution initially on this one, or maybe the defense? Or maybe are you in no man's land somewhere in between? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more daily recaps of this particular trial or our coverage on other crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next one is out there. And if you're really loving the content and you want to know how to best support the channel and get perks like early access to non-trial recap videos, consider becoming a member of Fight Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, I'll see you on day 2.